The music's on, the disco ball has dropped, and it's time to get this party started. You're listening to episode 4 of DiscoTrek, a Star Trek Discovery After Party podcast here on the Tricorder Transmissions Network. I'm your host, Heather Barker, and with me at the turntable is my favorite disco Gorn, my co-host, Jeff Hewlett. How are you doing tonight, Jeff?
I'm feeling much better this week than I was last week. Thank you, everybody out there, for your well wishes. I received so many direct messages and Facebook messages wishing me well. Thanks, everybody. Nice to have all that love out there.
You're sounding less Gorn tonight, I guess.
Yes. Next time I get sick, I'll be more Gorn-like, I promise.
All right. For those who aren't familiar with the podcast, we're a community-based Star Trek discotheque of sorts, focusing on each episode of Star Trek Discovery as they air. Tonight, we'll be discussing episode 5 of Star Trek Discovery, Choose Your Pain, yet another controversial episode in the land of Star Trek. With us to talk about the episode are 2 members of the unofficial Star Trek Las Vegas convention group on Facebook, which is the exclusive gateway to gain admission onto the show. We'd like to welcome for the first time Miss Lauren Gonzalez. Hi, Lauren. How are you?
Hi, fine. Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
We're excited to have someone that we haven't talked to before. So super thrilled to have you on. And then next up is our good friend, STLV buddy, Alex Perry. Hi, Alex. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Hey, I think I just heard you on Trek Ranks not too long ago.
That's right. I'm like 2 for 3 so far in the last few weeks.
That's pretty awesome. Well, we're super happy to have you both. We're going to hop into our discussion of episode 4 in just a moment, but first we have some announcements. As we've mentioned, DiscoTrek is community focused and evolved from our desire to give fans in our convention community a way to talk about Star Trek Discovery. To enter for your chance to join us, make sure you're a member of the unofficial Star Trek Las Vegas convention group on Facebook. Once you do that, you'll see a new post every Tuesday with the DiscoTrek image and information on the following week's recording time. It does change on occasion, so make sure to keep an eye on that. Just comment on that post and you'll be entered to be picked. We'll use a random generator to pick 2 winners on the following Saturday. Once you've been on the podcast, you can't come back, but there are still ways to be a part of the discussion. Jeff, do you want to tell people how to do that?
Absolutely. So we make an additional post on the Sunday prior to the episode airing, asking for your comments that we may include at the end of the following recording. So you can also, if you really want to, you can leave a 2-minute voicemail at 609-512-LLAP. That's 5527. So 609-512-5527 for your chance to get your message played at the end of the show. And we also, by the way, I want to give a quick shout out to some of our new Patreon patrons, one of whom is actually on this episode of DiscoTrek, Mr. Alex Perry. Thank you very much for your generous support of the show.
It is my great pleasure.
We were so happy when we saw that come through. Also, we're very happy to welcome Jocelyn Olson, Greg Rosier, and Julie Schoenborn. Thank you guys so much for your Patreon support of our show and our network. We're so happy that you're part of our Trek family. And by the way, if anybody else out there is looking to support our network or any of our shows, we do have a Patreon page that you can find at patreon.com/the-tricorder-transmissions, or you can visit our website, thetricordertransmissions.com, and click the big Patreon link on the right-hand side. So if you like what we do here on DiscoTrek or any of our Tricorder Transmission shows, please think about supporting our show. And becoming a patron of our show will give you instant access to our unedited episodes right after we record them. And oftentimes there's some bonus material before and after the actual episode that you don't get to hear unless you're a Patreon supporter. For instance, this show that we're recording tonight will be available for our Patreon patrons right after we're done recording it. And we've already planned to add some extra stuff at the end. So hopefully a lot of you will be out there listening to those, and we'll hear some really great feedback. So Heather, back to you.
Awesome. Thanks for all of that information. It was a mouthful.
Certainly was.
All right. So now's the time to let everyone know that there will be spoilers ahead. So make sure that you watched last night, or make sure that you watch Sunday night's episode, because we're going to talk about all the juicy details. There may even be some fan theories that we'll talk about. So keep that in mind. I know some people don't like those either. I think they're really awesome. I love all the speculation going on about what's going to happen. So just spoiler alert, keep that in mind. All right, so our show is a general discussion about the episode, but we do have 3 segments. Drop the Record, which will be our opening remarks and reaction to the episode. Play a New Track, where we explore what we learned that's new about the Star Trek universe. And Spin It Again, our look back at standout moments, scenes, characters, just about anything you feel is worth a second glance. So let's go ahead and dive in. Let's drop the record. This episode, guys, I feel like every week I need to watch these episodes more and more. Like, I think I've watched Choose Your Pain 3 times now. The last 2 times I've done, like, I think 2 or 3 viewings. There's so much in them, so much to talk about. So let's go ahead and open up with our first reactions to the show. Lauren, what did you think about Choose Your Pain?
Well, I was really looking forward to this episode. I hate to have to admit this, but I didn't watch the original series episodes that involved mud. And before this episode aired, I had to go back and at least watch one of them so that I could kind of get some sort of background. I mean, I already, kind of knew who Mud was, just, because I'm a Trekkie and I have lots of Trekkie friends. So, I knew about him, but not very much. So I did have to go back and watch some of the original series episodes. So I was looking forward to this. I really like that Discovery is trying to, incorporate characters that we're familiar with. So that definitely excites me. One thing that I love most about this episode is that in comparison to the Sunday before's episode, we had sort of a more definable beginning, middle, and end to this episode, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I know that in the previous one, even though the previous one was really good, it sort of kind of left you feeling like, it was almost like more like a bridging episode, sort of like it just didn't really give us a resolution, so to speak.
Yeah.
So my first thing was, I was like, oh, I'm really impressed with this episode because we had a problem, we dealt with it, we dealt essentially with more than one problem, and it got resolved to our satisfaction. And so, so I was really impressed with this episode with that. There was only, 2 real things that were disappointing to me about this episode. And it's not, what we were discussing earlier, but I was a little bit upset about the fact that we left Mud behind. That was a little bit upsetting to me. But, looking past that, everything, there was a lot of other things I was really excited about on this episode. So
Awesome. Alex, what about you?
I loved this episode. I love each episode more than the one before. It's super easy to do my top 5 Star Trek Discovery episodes at the moment because it just runs 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I really like the way that they're crafting the story over the course of the season. You do, and that was most kind of exemplified tonight, where the tardigrade story could have stretched out over a whole season, right? I wasn't really expecting it to be resolved in the next episode.
Yeah.
So you do have sort of, this is not episodic Star Trek, right? There are these long story arcs that are clearly going to play out over the course of all 15 of the episodes of the season. But at the same time, you do have these kind of mini stories that are feeding into that overall arc that, we did have an episodic element this week with the Lorca kidnap, because he was kidnapped and rescued all in the space of one episode. And you did have kind of little storylines that were resolved from previous episodes like the tardigrade. So overall, I thought it was fantastic.
Yeah, Jeff, what do you think?
Well, Heather, we talked a little bit about this offline, I think, earlier today, so this may not be a big shock to you, but Discovery, I think, has finally thrown me for a loop, and I feel like I've started to get adjusted to new Trek, and this episode changed a lot of my opinions. Especially, I'm prepared to eat my words about Stamets from a couple episodes back. Totally gonna eat my words, put my foot right in my mouth. So I think this was a defining episode for his character. I loved what happened in this episode with him risking his own life to spare the tardigrade once he learns the truth about what the spore drive is doing to it. I thought that was bold and courageous, and it was a beautiful thing to do. I loved the extremes of Burnham's relationship with Saru in this episode. I thought it was so rocky at the beginning, in the middle. I really thought that it was going downhill, and they really turned it around in a very emotional way at the end. And now I'm so much more hopeful for their relationship. I feel like we kind of are starting to move past a lot of the tension that's been between the characters, especially in episode 3 and somewhat in episode 4. And I see a lot of the crew starting to gel a lot more with Burnham. That is, except maybe when Lorca finds out that the tardigrade isn't on the ship anymore and what the new solution for the spore drive might be. So we kind of don't have any idea what the lasting effects on using humans is going to be. So I love the fact that we've got things to think about. And I think, Alex, I'm gonna throw something right back at you real quick here. Even though I think Burnham does the right thing and frees the tardigrade at the end, if we think back to the conversation at the very beginning, Starfleet is out looking for more of them to install on other ships. So we may not be done with the tardigrade conversation in Discovery. They may find some more of them. So we may have to refight this battle. So more stuff to think about and more stuff to look forward to in the future.
I don't know what you guys thought, but I have a really hard time accepting that Starfleet would be out looking for these tardigrades. And maybe Starfleet at this point, we're just now understanding, how it affects the tardigrade.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that information had not been communicated to them, but that just seemed really odd. That was a hard thing for me to accept, that Starfleet would be out trying to find as many of those as possible. Plus, isn't this ship Discovery is designed specifically to jump. So wouldn't you have to be building more and more ships?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, you'd have to install the spore drive on other ships as well. But I think the argument, the moral argument is really going to be, since we did get the offhand comment by Saru that eugenics experiments are forbidden, the argument is going to be genetically modified humans running spore drives or these tardigrade creatures. What's Starfleet going to go for in a time of war and desperation? So that's a struggle.
But it isn't the Discovery, like with the disc, when it goes disco ball, as I say, like, isn't the design of the ship integrated to work with the spore drive? So does it have to be that specific kind of ship to work with the spore drive, or can any ship have a spore drive installed?
There is a comment early in the episode from Admiral Cornwell who says that the schematics have been sent to the new classified facility in Jefferson, Iowa, which I actually looked up on Google Maps is only 180 miles away from Riverside, the birthplace of Captain Kirk.
I caught that.
Yeah, and I think so. I think the idea behind it is that they're now planning to build a bunch more of them.
Okay.
And part of that whole conversation is they kind of need to keep the spore drive on the down low for a while longer because it's going to take some time for them to start producing these new ships. And it is target number 1 for the Klingon Empire now.
Yeah, I get overwhelmed thinking about how long it takes to build that ship. Anyway, details. I thought it was really interesting. I've been doing polls every week after each episode to see which episode has been people's favorite. This week was a little difficult because we now have 5 episodes and I can only put in 4 choices on Twitter. So I had to combine Vulcan Hello and Battle at the Binary Stars into one choice. And the final results had, out of 210 votes, we had 56% saying Choose Your Pain was their favorite episode. So I thought that was pretty cool. And, to Lauren's point, the fact that, it was somewhat episodic. And I think that hopefully has perhaps satiated some of the doesn't feel like Star Trek for a lot of people, where a lot of us are still really wanting to have that resolution, and now we've gotten it in a few different ways. For me, every time I watch the first episode, I think I watch it with a little bit too much skepticism or something, because I'll raise my eyebrow here and there. And then when I sit down to do my rewatch and take notes, that's when I really start to fall in love with the episodes. I don't know if it's just taking that closer look and also pausing to like write down the quotes, because this is, if you sit and focus on what they're saying, like the writing is just so phenomenal. But this episode had so much to it, especially with character development. I think next to Context is for Kings, this is probably my number two. A lot of that has to do with the way that it ended, which we'll talk about down the road. But as I've said, when we saw Context is for Kings, I kind of was like, yeah, like this is awesome. And when this one ended, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. So getting a reaction like that tells me that it's a really great episode. What do you guys think about talking about character development a little bit and focusing on some of these characters and moving through the episode that way?
Well, I personally am glad that we are seeing a little bit more, because I don't know about you guys, but even in episode 5, I'm not even 100% sure what half of these characters' names are. Like, I know Burnham, we know Saru, we know Lorca, I mean, we know Stamets, but we don't even really get to know Dr. Culber until now.
Yeah.
And, I could barely remember what some of the helmsmen's names are. Like half the time, they don't use their names for whatever reason very much.
No.
So I'm really glad that that we're seeing more. And on my second watch of this episode, I appreciated that much more the banter between Culber and Stamets in the, close to the beginning, where he and Burnham are coming to approach Stamets, and, Culber is like, she's like, I can talk to him. And he's like, oh yeah, sure. Let me know how that goes. And so that whole banter at the beginning is that much better, knowing sort of how the rest of the episode plays out. So I was really excited to see that. And definitely the ending with Burnham and Saru, the way that they talked, and the way, he's finally admitting exactly what his feelings are about Burnham, I think is so great. Just all of those conversations, I think, really let us get to know them more, which I'm really happy about, because I really didn't feel like I knew these characters as well as I would like to until maybe now. Like now I feel like I'm definitely getting to know them better.
Yeah, I've heard that from a lot of people, is that they're not connecting with the characters. I'm personally not having that problem. I kind of love everyone. Well, I wasn't a big fan of Landry, but that's because she was Landry. I was still curious to learn about her, but she was obviously an off-putting character. I don't know that we were necessarily supposed to like her. And to be quite honest, let's talk about Saru for a little bit, because I really didn't like Saru in this episode for a while. I mean, it's the whole story with Saru here, I think, is really interesting. And my personal belief, I think that Saru is suffering from PTSD. I think that what happened on the Shenzhou was very difficult for him, not just losing his captain, but as we find out, losing the possibility of being first officer and having that taken away from him has caused a lot of issue with him. One of the things that I really loved when he went to go do his, what's the word that I'm looking for that I can't think of?
When he went to run those protocols,
so
his self-evaluation.
His self-evaluation, essentially, and goes in to look up the most decorated captains. And I don't know about you guys, but it was really cool to see those names. It was most cool to see Robert April's name on there, which is a deviation from talking about Saru here. But I smiled when I saw that. I'm assuming everybody else had the same reaction.
Yeah, I wonder what Jim Morehouse thought of that, by the way. Mr. Anti-Animated Series.
Yeah, well, I think that it's not only a nod to the animated series and making that canon, but I mean, just it's a nod to Star Trek history
Yep,
and Roddenberry. So I think it can be construed as both. I
of
think
course.
both are great. Sorry, Jim Morehouse. I don't care what you think. Yeah, that was really cool. But so we just see this side of Saru where he's completely dismissive of the fact that not only are they concerned about what is happening to the tardigrade, but that it is sentient. And he's like, I don't care, crack it open. Like he's willing to risk the life of this creature to save his captain. And I think that that's directly related to what happened on the Shenzhou. What did you guys think
Yeah.
about this side of Saru? Alex?
I think that that conversation at the end of the episode between Saru and Burnham has an extra couple of layers to it. Saru is telling Burnham that he's deeply jealous of the fact that she learned at the right hand of Georgiou, who, as we saw from the list of captains that you mentioned, is one of the most decorated captains in Starfleet, whereas Saru is learning at the right hand of Gabriel Lorca. And I think his actions in this episode kind of demonstrate the disservice that he was done by not being able to learn at the side of Georgiou, because he does sort of act in this episode like a mini Lorca.
Mm-hmm.
It's the ends justify the means, and with no thought to the consequences. And I think by the time we get to the end of the episode, and he has that moment after the conversation where he says, go save the tardigrade's life, I think that's his recognition that Lorca has really rubbed off on him when he wanted to be sort of in the Burnham Georgiou mold of the type of Starfleet officer that he wanted to be.
Lauren, do you have any thoughts?
It's hard to say. It was disheartening to see. I was, though, I feel like he did say, if I think he was essentially trying to not believe that tardigrade was sentient at all.
Mm-hmm.
I think he was trying really hard to just not accept that. But, I was glad that he at least was like, if that's the case, I will face the consequences of my actions, because he obviously knows he was going to be wrong or in the wrong if that was the case. So I was, glad to hear that from him. And I don't know if part of it is sort of his prey mentality. I don't know if it's a survive at all costs sort of thing. Hard to say. I hadn't really fleshed that out fully yet in my head on how I feel about that. But I was glad that he was accepting of his actions, should they prove to be that they're hurting the tardigrade.
Yeah. Jeff, did you have any insight there on Saru?
Yeah, I had a couple of thoughts. One, Alex hit on a lot of the things that I would have said, but there's a couple of other things that I also thought about. I think by his own admission, he wasn't really feeling like he was ready to step into the captain's chair. And this was a really difficult time to be put into that situation when you're not really ready for it. Unexpectedly, your captain gets kidnapped. He's in Klingon space. You're under pressure to try to get him back, because he has information about the spore drive. He's very valuable. So letting him go is not really an option. Granted, he may not crack, of course, because he is a Starfleet captain, and we know Starfleet captains are really good at being tortured. But I think another thing that I had been thinking about after I rewatched this a little bit more, because I was kind of bothered too, Heather, by the fact that he seemed to have no regard for the life of the tardigrade. But I was thinking to myself, maybe, and this may be a stretch, but maybe he wasn't sensing that it or anybody else on the ship was going to die in this operation. I think he wasn't getting the sense of death that he got, that we saw when they were facing off with the Klingons in the earlier episodes. I think maybe he might have relied on that a little bit in his decision, saying, well, you know what, I'm not feeling like this is going to go wrong, so maybe the creature is not in as bad shape as they say it is, and therefore it'll survive this, and we can worry about this after we get Lorca back, potentially. And also, we know a little bit about his species. what their culture was like, but we don't know what their overall general attitude is in these types of situations, what's acceptable to his race on his planet, his home world, and how they think about things like that. So I don't know. It was hard because he's not human. I mean, we can project ourselves onto the human characters and judge them by our own sense of moral code. But how do we do that with aliens? I'm not really sure. It's really hard to process that for me without all the details. But yeah, it did put me off, and I was kind of looking for other explanations to it.
And I think, to borrow an episode title, context is for kings, right? Where, without that background knowledge about Saru's people and what their sort of natural state is, it's tough to really contextualize a lot of his actions in this episode. But I think that will come.
Yeah, it's difficult because, on the point of him, being an alien species and being a prey species, I feel like that's even more reason for him to empathize with the tardigrade that is being preyed upon right now by us. And then, knowing that it's sentient or suspecting that it's sentient or whatever, that was difficult for me to process. But, I was really happy to see him confess that he knew what he did, and at the end of the day to talk to Burnham and to kind of see that resolution between the two of them, and his confession that he's angry and he's jealous. It was actually going to be one of my call outs at the end. There is just, this is why it's Star Trek. This is one of the reasons why it's Star Trek to me, is that Star Trek has always given us an example of how we should be, and that we should communicate. Like, all of our characters in Star Trek typically confront each other, talk about their issues rationally, and work it out. And this was another great example where he simply communicated. She asked, "Are you really afraid of me?" And he explained what was going on there, and that resulted in a really touching moment where Burnham gave him Georgiou's telescope. And I love the quote there: "You should have the privilege to see the universe the way she did."
Yeah.
Which is just really touching, in my opinion. But let's jump over, since we're talking about characters. We won't spend a ton of time here, but we met a lot of characters in this episode. So I guess let's talk about Mr. Harcourt Fenton Mudd for a little bit. Alex, what did you feel like when Harry Mudd was cast? Were you excited to see this character? And did the character live up to your expectations? What's your overall reaction?
I was, and it did. I think there was some concern when he was first cast, and I certainly felt that as well. Not about Rainn Wilson, but about the character of Harry Mudd himself, right? I mean, the character of Harry Mudd, as depicted in the original series, is very much sort of a product of the era. And I'm not sure that exact character depiction would necessarily fly for modern audiences. I mean, the first time we see him, he is literally selling women. And so, that is a concept that doesn't necessarily translate as well. But what I think, because excuse me, Discovery is set 10 years before the original series, it gives us an opportunity to see Harry Mudd at a very different part of his life, and also, frankly, how he turns into, this boorish con man that we find in the original series. I mean, a lot of people, some people online have been, saying, oh, I sided more with Harry Mudd than I did with Lorca. I think that was the point in some of those scenes, because he does make a number of great points about Starfleet encroachment on other territory. I mean, it really retreads some of the same themes that you saw in last year's Star Trek Beyond. And those are great points to make. I mean, it's the same thing that Krall said in that movie. Sometimes when you push on the frontier pushes back. And that's not an invalid point to make.
Yeah, Lauren, I think you had a little bit of, let me start over there. Lauren, how did you feel about Harry Mudd?
Yeah, so I did have some thoughts on that. So again, I didn't have a ton of background on Mud, but I did watch Mud's Women, so the episode that Alex mentioned, and I did find that episode again because I'd never seen it before. I was like, is Harry Mudd selling women here? Like, this is this is really bizarre. But so I wasn't really sure what to expect when when I going into this episode. And so and Rainn Wilson, I've definitely seen in other things. So I was excited to see Rainn Wilson in this episode as Mud. And when I watched it, I thought that he did have some great lines. And that was one of the things that I wrote down as a moment that stood out to me was, yes, his saying that Starfleet essentially started this war the moment they decided to boldly go, where no one had gone before. And it was like really like hit like hard, I was like, oh, he was just the things that he was saying just made so much sense. And I feel like Rainn really, really made Mud, I don't even know how to put it, just maybe a much better character than at least in the episode that I watched him in the original series. So I was really excited about that. But again, that leads into then it was upsetting to me then to have Lorca and Tyler break out and be like, no, you're not coming with us. And I was like, oh, I don't know how I feel about that. So I'm really, really conflicted about that whole moment. I'm not sure, what you guys think about that, but I felt like, even with what he did, there's no reason why, if nothing else, he could go back to the Federation and, stand trial there for whatever crimes he may have committed. But so those are essentially my thoughts on Mud in this episode.
Jeff, what do you think? Should they have taken Mud with them?
Well, no, I don't think they should have, but the only reason that I don't think they should have, and I guess I'll throw these cards on the table. This was something I was going to bring up later in this episode, but I think leaving Mud behind, coupled with the fact that, and I'm going to throw this out there for everybody to comment on, leaving Laurel disfigured at the end of that episode instead of killing her, I think that Lorca has set himself up for a couple of really nasty revenge plots coming up down the road in this show, especially since the two of them were already kind of in cahoots with Mud sending over intel to her to use for in her interrogation. So I think that we may have a little team up going on there. It's a little rogue prediction, but I think we may have a very angry Harry Mudd at being left behind and a very, very angry Laurel at being disfigured by Lorca. So I was pleasantly surprised, although I didn't have a lot of expectations for the Mudd character. I was trying to keep my mind clean about that since I am an original series fanatic. I loved it, so I'm very, very familiar with Mudd. So I knew they were going to do a darker take on the character. That was just a given. So I think they pulled that off really well. The dialogue was great. I loved the chip on the shoulder about Starfleet that you guys mentioned already. I thought that was a great setup. And, we've already set him up as a scoundrel, although we don't know his full intentions yet. But we do know that he was working with the Klingons, and we do know that he was diverting all of his beatings off onto other prisoners. So he's a little bit on the nefarious side there, I think. And I think Tyler had much more of an opinion on Mudd since he'd been there with him a lot longer. So maybe I think so Lorca was siding with him and leaving Mudd behind. So I don't really feel bad about Mudd being left behind, just to wrap back around to that. And mostly because I'm really looking forward to seeing how angry he is when he comes back and what's going to happen down the road with that character.
Yeah, as he said, you haven't seen the last of hardcore Fenton Mudd.
Mm-hmm. Oh, no.
Which I'm excited to see him. I'm a fan of Rainn Wilson. I wasn't a huge fan of The Office, but I do like him. So despite any misgivings I may have had about having the character of Mudd in this series, I had faith that it wasn't going to be, the Mudd that we don't like. I invested in that faith that they were going to do something a little different with him, and so I liked what I saw, and Stuart was a fun little creature. I thought that was very fitting. for Mud to have. I just have to mention again really quick. I asked Twitter today what their reaction was, and it seemed like most people loved his casting. And so that was kind of like they were excited to hear he got cast. But what I was really happy with is that 30% said that he was better than expected. I'd heard a lot of hesitation about what they were going to do with him, and so I'm really happy that overall people seem pretty pleased with our first introduction to Mud. I'm going to use Mud as a transition here and go ahead and move us a little bit forward into our Play a New Track section, where we talk about what we learned about Star Trek universe. And I'm using Mud because we learned a little bit about Mud and his backstory. It's just a tiny little thing, but I really liked the story that he wanted to impress Stella's father, and we all know about Stella. Borrowed money to buy her a moon, and I thought that was really neat to learn that, and that apparently he also had a successful business before the war started. But I felt like he was a really great character to kind of tie us back to the people on Earth, because aside from Corvin 2, we really haven't had that connection, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So I thought that was pretty cool. So let's go ahead and talk about things that we learned that are new. Alex, did you find anything in this episode that was new to you, new to Star Trek?
One of the interesting things about this episode is that it didn't play so much with new ideas as it did just hit you with a ton of little Easter eggs and references from previous shows. So I do the canon connections articles over on Tricorder, and this episode I had to pull out a ton of different references. I think one of my favorite moments was just one shot. Aside from sort of, bringing April into the canon, later on in the episode, you get another of those map pictures.
Yeah.
Pulled right out of the Star Trek Star Charts by Jeffrey Mandel. That thing was chocked to the brim with references in it. I mean, every name you see calls back to a previous episode. Every single one does. And there's a lot of real deep cuts in that. But beyond just like the kind of little references, there's thematic stuff too that's being pulled out. I mean, the whole issue with Stamets injecting himself with the tardigrade DNA being not an option initially because eugenics experiments are forbidden, which is a callback to Khan Noonien Singh and the eugenics wars. I thought, there were. What I really like about the show so far is that they've drawn so many ideas and themes from the previous canon to weave together this story.
Completely.
Yeah. I'm really kind of wondering if at the end of this first season, we're just going to get this beautiful package of Star Trek wrapped in a bow. Like I just feel like, as we move on, all these pieces are kind of falling into place. And given we're using Discovery to bring new fans into the Star Trek family, I feel like there's so much here for those of us who have been fans for a long time. And all of those, I mean, we could go over that whole map sequence was just really cool. And that was just, one frame. You could take so much out of there, which was just really, really cool. So we had a reference to the Daystrom Institute in there, the classified database at the Daystrom Institute. That's another one. I love going through all of these Easter eggs. So
one of the when they're looking at the DNA, the last race that they cycle through is the Zoldans, a race that you saw in the Star Trek Next Generation first season episode Coming of Age for one scene, and that was it. Such a deep cut.
I missed that one totally. I did not have that one in my notes.
Yeah, I didn't.
What about you, Lauren?
So one thing that's kind of random, I guess, that maybe I didn't know this, or maybe everybody did, but when Lorca and the Admiral, they're having a discussion and they are talking about Michael Burnham, and they mention that there's a Starfleet regulation that allows him to conscript anybody into service in time of war.
Yep.
And I guess that's not something that I really realized was a thing, was a regulation, because, there certainly are a lot of people that I've noticed online that have been like, so, we're just going to ignore the fact that this mutineer suddenly has a position on a vessel. And, and not that I gave too much thought to that, because obviously, there's a reason why she's there, but I didn't really realize that there's also regulation that's like, yes, anybody could do anything, I guess, during time of war. So that was a new piece of information to me. And then, of course, I think the other big thing that we learned about was, Lorca's backstory, what he was doing before he ended up on the Discovery, how his eyes got the way that they did. And you're like, huh. something
let's talk about that
there.
Let's talk about that, because that was a lot to swallow.
That was
he his crew is, the ship was basically on its way to be overtaken by Klingons, and so he self-destructed. He blew everybody up and he escaped. He believes, which, much like Michael Burnham, who attempted to mutiny the Discovery. Eventually her mutiny failed, right? She didn't actually take over and do anything, but he made a decision much like she did. She thought she was saving everyone, and here was Lorca believing that he is saving his crew from torture and a slow public death by Klingons. Jeff, I kind of know your thoughts because I heard you on Discovering Trek. But if you want to reiterate, what was going through your mind when you learned that he blew up his people?
Well, I think we'd already seen in that prison that they were in the brutality of those Klingons. So what he said about not wanting his crew to be enslaved and beaten up and killed by the Klingons, it resonated with me, and it was a tough decision to make, but I think I felt like I could side with him on that. I didn't hold it against him. I know it's a tough decision to make, and a lot of people think it was wrong, but I don't know. I think that in the heat of battle, and I think it was just a decision that he felt he had to make to spare those people from being treated the way we saw the Klingons treating the people in that prison. So, controversial topic, controversial opinion, probably.
Alex, what do you think?
This has been my one-man crusade so far today on the internet, has been the issue of Lorca, because I think, it's an area where there's clearly a lot of, he's a controversial character, right? A news site that I won't name described this episode as Star Trek without a soul, mostly because of that character. I also saw somebody else describe it as morally bankrupt Star Trek. I think that Lorca is a character who, you're not supposed to sympathize with the decisions that he's made. And Star Trek isn't a show about characters who get things right all the time. It's a show about characters who get things right in the end, and for those characters who don't get things right, for whom justice is served. And because this is an arc-based show rather than being episodic, right? In a previous show, Lorca would have shown up for an episode like Captain Maxwell, started a war with the Cardassians, and been clapped in irons by the end, and the right thing is done. But this character is going to play out over a number of different episodes, and he could really go one of two ways, I think. He could go the Captain Maxwell, Admiral Satie, Admiral Dougherty route, where, eventually his chickens come home to roost and justice is served because he is an the ends justify the means kind of guy for whom, that doesn't kind of work within this Federation framework. Or he's going to be one of those characters who grows and evolves and sort of learns the errors of his ways and develops over time. And I'm excited to see which direction he goes in. But I don't think incorporating these elements into his character therefore means that, this is Star Trek is totally off the reservation in terms of being aligned with its philosophy.
Yeah. Lauren, did you have any final thoughts on what we learned about Lorca?
Well, I was going to mention that I will admit, I was surprised, when he very matter of factly was like, oh, that's not really the whole story. I actually blew them up. I was like, oh, okay. I was not expecting that. So I was definitely taken aback by that. But and I agree a little bit with Jeff that maybe that was better for them in the long run. But I think I also kind of need to know how did he get into a position that he was outside of the ship anyways? Like, how did he get to that point that he was able to go ahead and blow them up? Like, why wasn't he on there with
Yeah.
the rest of the crew? But that aside, I mean, I guess I could understand why he did what he did. But then I guess the other question is then how then did he get from that point to being the captain on this top secret ship
Yeah. Yeah.
right after that?
Yeah,
So
Starfleet was
I
okay with it.
wondered, yeah, that's a question
yeah,
I also had is that here's
yeah.
someone who, uh, uh, you could say murder, you could say euthanized, I guess, his crew. I think it can be both there. I just have so many questions about Starfleet right now.
Right, right,
The
right.
bigger related question is, why did the captain not go down with the ship?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, exactly.
Yeah.
How did he
Yeah.
not end up being on the ship at that time? Like, I just don't,
Hmm.
I think I need to know that part is why he was in that position to begin with. How did he
Yeah.
get outside the ship to do that?
Unless he
But
evacuated everyone off the bridge, put it in self-destruct, like silent self-destruct, and then took a shuttle pod away or something and left everybody to
right.
blow. I mean, it's definitely something that's difficult to stomach. And I was also very shocked. The show continues to shock me. uh, so I still am just very intrigued by Lorca. I don't hate him, and I feel almost awful saying that about someone who chose to blow up, a ship and leave. Uh, we got a really great quote out of the scene where he's with Tyler in the Klingon Raider, referring back to the title of the show. We choose our own pain. Mine helps me remember, referring to his
Mhm.
eyes. So we imagine that he feels some remorse for what he did, and that's why he really doesn't go and try to have his eyes corrected and everything. So, Jeff, did you learn anything new from this episode?
Aside from the two things that we just mentioned, I wanted to throw one other quick thing out there, and this may or may not be a big discussion point, but Laurel speaks English, the language of the enemy, and that must have
Yeah,
taken a while to learn. And where did she learn it from? So I thought that was fascinating, and Lorca even says that she speaks it very well. So
yeah.
she must have been studying it for a while.
Well, we know that she comes from a house of spies.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's part of the explanation. And I did want to emphasize to everyone that that was Laurel. Apparently, there was a lot of confusion, and people did not recognize that that is who she was.
Mm-hmm.
I will
Uh,
admit I was one of those people. I did not know, and I'm serious, like I did not know that was Laurel
yeah.
until after Trek, essentially. I was like, oh, that was her that whole time.
Yep.
And I don't know if it's just because unfortunately a good many of those Klingons are not it's really hard to differentiate some of
It,
them, but I feel like
yeah.
her face was slightly different in this episode as well. But yes, I too did not realize it was Laurel. Again, they didn't use her name, which just
Right.
kind of goes back to that
And
one point that I had where half these people I swear they don't use their
yeah.
names.
And they, referred to her as captain of the ship. And last
Mhm.
time we left her, she wasn't a captain.
Right, right.
Um, and she was speaking English, which it was almost ironic that I had just, sorry, I keep mentioning these polls, but I had done a poll last week, or yeah, I think the end of last week, asking about the use of the subtitles because I've heard a lot of really great things about using them, and then I've heard that a lot of people are having difficulty following along, looking at the subtitles, not being able to watch the show. People with disabilities, it's difficult. So I asked about that, and then here we have an episode where we have Klingons, but they're all speaking English. So I just thought that was kind of funny. Beautiful. She speaks English so well. I'm captivated by her, and I think I'll use my things I was going to point out for this section have already been discussed, which was what I said about Mud and then Lorca. So I wanted to take a little bit to talk about the other new character we met that is Ash Tyler.
Or is he?
Or is he?
Right.
Exactly. So
Mhm.
this is where we get into a little bit of fan theory and speculation. And again, I know how Jeff feels because I heard it earlier today. But so I guess I'll just say, so one of the theories out there is that Ash Tyler is actually Voke. Last time we saw Voke, he was going to be sent to the matriarchs by Laurel. And so now 3 weeks later, we have this Ash Tyler appear in a Klingon prison vessel. What do you think, Alex? Do you think?
I am 100% on board with the Tyler is Vogue theory for a few reasons. One, the actor who plays Vogue, Javeed Iqbal, has never been seen in person, has never appeared at a Discovery press event. The cast, who clearly love each other and spend a lot of time together, like Mary Chieffo has never talked about working with Javeed Iqbal, not once, which makes me think that, and he has no other credits to his name other than playing Vogue on Star Trek Discovery. Add to that the fact that Shazad Latif was originally announced as playing a Klingon character, albeit not Vogue. He was originally announced as playing Cole, and then later announced that he had switched to playing Tyler. And nobody in the press has ever really asked him about that, which makes me wonder if that's off the table for asking him about it. And then within the show, some of the dialogue between Laurel and Vogue at the end of the last episode talking about, I'm going to take you to House Mokai, the House of Deceivers, and you're going to have to be prepared to sacrifice everything. And then in this episode, there was a line right before Tyler and Lorca escape where Laurel says to Tyler, after everything we've been through, when at most she's been on that ship for 3 weeks, because we know this takes place 7 months after the Battle of the Binary Stars, and the last episode where they were still on the sarcophagus ship was 6 months after the battle. I think it just all points to a classic Arne Darwin situation where we will later discover that Tyler is in fact Vogue.
So I have to throw out one more tiny piece of information that I actually picked up from Trek FM. I think it was Bruce Gibson in their commentary show. And that is that Shazad Latif's name is actually Shazad Khalik Iqbal. So the Iqbal that's in the Javeed Iqbal is the same name, which to me, that was just a little bit too coincidental that the character name shares part of his actual birth name. And to me, that was kind of like, all right, we're really there. I thought that some of the dialogue between Tyler and Lorca, to me, and maybe I'm just reading it this way because I want to believe it, but here's someone that we're meeting for the first time who's just already like kissing the ring of the king, basically. I already lost one captain, I won't lose another, giving the food to him. And just, I don't know, it kind of felt that way to me. Lauren, had you heard this theory, and what do you think?
Had heard, okay, so the theory that you mentioned, I'm also totally on board with, but I had only heard like parts of that theory. But I admit that while I was watching the episode, it felt like something was not right there. Like and Lorca was like, you look fine after being here for 7 months. And he was like, oh, well, she's taking a liking to me. And I'm like, the Klingons hate humans right now. Like, I don't see that happening.
Yeah. And Klingon sex is pretty violent, right? So I think
So
you have some broken bones and bruises there.
Right. So, I mean, he already something similar, but I mean, Lorca even said it himself that he was like, or you're lying, to him, right from the get-go. And so it kind of makes you wonder, because then he was like, well, he was accusing Mud of being the one who was a spy, which I mean, obviously, I guess that was clear as well, but it just seemed like, I don't know, just something didn't seem right with the Tyler character. And, they suddenly get out really quickly. Also, I was going to mention this earlier, but it did also seem a little weird that two humans took out two Klingon warriors. That just also seemed a little weird.
Yeah.
Snapping Klingon warrior next. So, I mean, if he was a Klingon, that makes a little bit more sense. But one thing that I had read, even before this episode aired, I believe, or maybe it was right after, but somebody had mentioned online, hey, has anybody even seen a picture of the person who plays Voke? And, people were like, oh, I guess we haven't. And they were digging into it. But I didn't really realize that, they were digging into it, obviously, for that reason, that nobody's ever seen him. And now that you say that, I'm like, yeah, I could totally see that. And that definitely makes a lot of sense to me for all the reasons that Alex mentioned, for sure.
The final quote we get from Tyler after they beam in, which I gotta just shout out to the 2-man transporter team, is that there's no place I'd rather be than Discovery, essentially. And so that was just very on point. So Jeff, I know how you feel. And do you want to share how you feel? Has this information affected that at all?
Well, we said no nitpicks, right? We're not nitpicking.
We're not going to dwell on nitpicks. Yeah.
Okay, fine. So I can totally see your points, and it makes sense, and I get it. And I'm just going to say that if it is true, I feel that the setup is a little too convenient. I don't know. I think, how did they know they were going to be able to capture Lorca? How did they know he was going to be in the shuttle? How did they know to put, Tyler and L'Rell on that prison ship? And it just seems so convenient that that's how they would get him onto Discovery. It seems like there are so many holes in a plot like that. There are so many loose ends that just may not have worked out. I don't know. You guys may be completely right. And down the road, I may be bowing my head to you and saying, oh, yep, you guys are right. But then I would be even more convicted in the fact that I felt like that was just too weak of a string of conveniences that would have to happen for that plan to get him on Discovery to be successful. Just my opinion.
I think that maybe Harry Mudd plays a part in all of this. Again, I'm not going to go nitpick everything on where they got the information and whatnot. And again, it's been 3 weeks that we're aware of. So 3 weeks between Voke, going to the matriarchs and now looking like a human.
And speaking perfect English.
And speaking really great English as well. I think that there were some interesting tie-ins with Saru's comment about the eugenics experiments being forbidden. And yeah, that could just relate specifically to the tardigrade, or that can kind of foreshadow what we're going to see happen. Regardless, I think it's a pretty cool theory. Yep. I will be interested to see if we're wrong, and what happens. But I am quite smitten with Ash Tyler, just gonna say. I am really curious to see his role in the future. So that's pretty cool there. I think that we are ready to go ahead and move into Spin It Again and kind of go back to what we feel deserves a second glance. I think we've mentioned some of them throughout, but maybe we've all, figured out some new things to talk about if we've already gone over that. So, Lauren, why don't you start us off this time? What stood out to you that you'd like to revisit?
So there were, just a couple of things, but I noticed that Dr. Culber, when they were talking to him earlier in the episode, he said something about how the CMO needed him for something. And I guess it wasn't really until that moment that I realized that he wasn't the chief medical officer on that ship. And so it's interesting. There was an article I read that had pointed out that so far, other than Lorca and Saru, the the characters that we've really gotten to know are just sort of these I shouldn't say low level, but they're like lower ranking, lower ranking officers.
Yeah.
Because at this point, I don't know who the CMO is. I don't know who the chief engineer is, for that matter.
And can I pop in really quick just to clarify, because there was a scene that I completely missed last night. It got pointed out somewhere else, and it's when Stamets has been injected, did the jump and all that stuff, and then one of the character, Miss Lieutenant Owashekan on the bridge, has his life stats pulled up, and it says on there Chief Engineer. I did some research today and tweeted out to Star Trek Writers Room and Ted Sullivan, and Ted Sullivan did confirm that he is not the chief engineer, Pab. Okay, so Ted Sullivan said, I'd say he's the chief engineer of Spore Drive, but not of engineering. There was definitely some confusion there, and I just wanted to clarify that for everyone who may have had that question. So sorry to interrupt you, but continue.
No, you're fine. I mean, I'm glad that you confirmed that, because I was like, if it's not him, I'm not really sure who it is. So I think that is a really interesting concept, maybe a newer concept for us in the Star Trek universe, where all of these characters that we're actually getting to really know and enjoy are not, high ranking officers on this ship at all, or not officers at all in the case of Michael Burnham. So that's, I think, really an exciting thing. And I also had wanted to point out that I really enjoyed watching Tilly, Stamets, and Burnham all working together. Like, I think that's going to be a great trio for us, down the road. But watching them together was a lot of fun, and
watching them science. Sounds like to get their science on.
I thought that was really cool to watch. And then I guess the only other thing was that I kind of mentioned it earlier, but I felt like the entire way the episode ended was like perfect, like just the most perfect track. Just that way that we saw Saru and Burnham having their discussion, and him admitting everything to her, and her giving the telescope to him, and then we saw Burnham and Tilly releasing the tardigrade, and then after that we saw Culber and Stamets together, and I just thought it was just great. Like, it was so great. And then, as you mentioned earlier, just the way the episode ended might have been one of the most, like, everything was going really great, and that ending might have been one of the most terrifying endings I've ever seen. Like, it totally threw me. Like, everything was cool, and then it was the music and the whole mirror thing, and I was like, oh my god, it was actually a little alarming.
So, as you got all those good feelings going on, and you're like, whoa.
It was definitely I don't know, it made an impression for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to follow up really quickly talking about those characters on the bridge who we're still not getting a lot of them, but they at least all had lines for the most part this time. Lieutenant Detmer, Lieutenant Owashekan, Commander Arium, and what's his face? Milton Richter. He actually had a line. He's a communications guy. And then we did also meet, I think he was Lieutenant Rice. Yeah. So it's really great to see people of color on the bridge. Did they make up for the ones we've lost? No, not necessarily, but I'm glad to see a diverse bridge crew. I'm glad that they all got lines. I hope that we get to learn a little bit more about them in the future. So, Alex, what about you? What do you feel deserves a little extra recognition?
I just want to come back to that last shot again, with Stamets in the mirror. That was so intense and so creepy after everything that we'd seen. Having that real kind of feel-good set of resolutions, and then kind of have that kick off this whole extra plot line and issue that's probably going to push through the rest of the series and lead to something that was spoiled by Jonathan Frakes that was later confirmed by Akiva Goldsman, which I won't say because I don't want to spoil it because it is a huge spoiler for the rest of the show.
We already talked about, we talked about it, I guess, in a shore leave for the convention where that was announced. So yeah, we can assume, we can speculate on what that last scene suggests.
I'll put it this way: the man standing in a mirror, and I think that has implications for the rest of the show. And as Trekcore pointed out, there has been a lot of kind of mirror symbolism and mirror imagery that have come up throughout the first 5 episodes that I think is leading towards something in that area.
Yeah, and the episode started essentially with a mirror, with Burnham, at the helm of the spore drive, with herself in the spore drive. I mean, take it as you want, but it's, technically kind of a mirror image of one inflicting pain, one feeling the pain. So I thought that was kind of interesting for sure. And I don't know when we're going to see potential mirror action without being too spoilery there. Maybe sometime down the road. Jeff, what about you?
Well, I'm glad that you brought up that the beginning little bit with Burnham. I took that as, she's dreaming about, herself feeling the same pain, inflicting and feeling the same pain that the tardigrade was feeling. So obviously that tells us how convicted she was about it and how concerned she was about it. And I like the fact that when you get to the end of the episode, you get that catharsis for her as she gets to release it back into space, see it come out of its hibernation state and zip off into space and be free again. So I like that kind of a bookends at both ends of the episode there. So giving her that bit of a relief, and you kind of see a real smile on her face that she's, she feels she's done something, and she did do something really, really good for that poor creature. So that was a standout 2 moments to me, that the beginning there and the end of that little arc. And I guess the little more exposure we get to how brutal the Klingons can treat humans, I think that stood out to me as well. The way that they run their prisons, but not letting their prisoners bond to each other by having them choose who gets beaten up and, potentially killed several times a day. So I think that was pretty interesting. Gives us a little more exposure into, just how brutal they can be. And I mean, one of the big questions that I put it out there earlier was, Lorca's maiming of or disfiguring of L'Rell. I'm assuming that he meant to do that as kind of a payback for the torture, because he obviously could have killed her when she was laying on the floor after he shot her in the face, but he chose to leave her there. So I thought that was a little bit of insight into Lorca's character. A little bit. I don't know, but how did you guys take that? Did you think about that at all? Did it stand out at all?
Yeah, I didn't. I mean, honestly, I assume that she's there for reasons in the future and didn't really contemplate why he left her. Thinking about it later, I kind of found it curious because I feel like Lorca might be one to just kill somebody, kill the person that tortured him. But I'm excited to see her new makeup.
Yeah, really. I mean, he vaporized another Klingon seconds before that, and he had the dead drop on her. I mean, I see how he could have possibly missed. I'm just looking forward to seeing what happens in the future. Alex, what do you think? How'd you feel about that?
Yeah, I think to your earlier point, Jeff, I think Lorca made a couple of mistakes in this episode that will probably have repercussions further down the line. I mean, we know from that very first trailer that was released at Comic-Con that, there's that Mudd returns again, because there's a scene in that trailer that didn't appear in this episode where Burnham and Mudd have an interaction. So that storyline is not over. And I think the choices that Lorca made in this episode, potentially done out of anger rather than out of rationality, will have consequences.
Yeah. Lauren, did you have any final thoughts there on why Lorca left her, didn't kill her?
No, I was just more along the feelings that was just a plot device, like because they're going to need Laurel later. I mean, there seemed to be no other good reason. Like it was mentioned. I mean, he just literally vaporized, these Klingons, and then she comes along and he's like, "Nah, I'm just gonna maim your face." That just seems like there would be no reason for that other than the fact that she needs to survive for the show.
Yeah.
So I didn't give that one too much thought because I was like, I mean, she's one of the main characters, so I guess
definitely. Well, looking forward to seeing what Neville and Glenn do with this new makeup, with this wonder if she's going to get an implant or just have a scar. I guess we will find out down the road. So I've got 2 points I'd like to close on here. The first one I'm going to use to tempt everyone to become a patron. We had a pretty, we'll say, controversial use of language in this episode. And I decided today, after listening to a lot of Discovery podcasts, that I didn't actually want to focus on that. However, after asking everyone on the podcast, we're going to discuss that at the end of the episode. So all of our patrons will have access to that immediately. Any level patron has access to that. So if you'd like to hear our thoughts on the profanity used in this week's episode, please feel free to join us. All right. My final moments here, I have got to spend not just on Culber and Stamets and that final scene, but on Stamets throughout the episode, because I feel like we just had some really phenomenal character development for him, and he is by far my MVP for this week's episode.
Totally.
I just and well, no, I should not be afraid to say things that I feel strongly about. I'm a queer person, and we're, on Shore Leave and on the Tricorder transmissions, we're obviously very supportive of the LGBT community. So I was just really happy with our final scene with an intimate moment between Culber and Stamets. That scene was so very, very touching for me. I got all the warm fuzzies watching it. I thought that it was just really great, and I guess I'll stop there. I don't have a speech prepared. I feel like I should, but it's been really disheartening to see some of the comments leading up to Discovery once it was announced that we were going to have gay characters in this series, and that really makes me question some parts of Star Trek fandom. But I thought that this scene was so tastefully done and extremely touching, and I am in love with Culber. I think he's such a great character. So that's my comments there. Did anybody else want to chime in on how they felt about that scene? Not specifically the very ending, but just the scene of them together.
Fantastic and long overdue.
Agreed.
Yay.
Right, it was great. I was really happy to see that. And as I mentioned, it just made the discussions that they had earlier like just that much better. Just the way that they interact with each other. It's really great. It was good to see.
It was, I've been watching it kind of, knowing that they are partners. And I was like, well, what would this be like for people who didn't already know that? Would they pick up on all the little, little jibs and jabs that they're making? And like Lauren, you had mentioned the little comments in the beginning where Burnham was like, yeah, I got Stamets to do this. And Culber was like, well, I'd like to know how, or whatever.
Right.
That stuff was all really cute. I think they're so great together. Like, I think those two characters complement each other so well. So, well done. Well done to the writers, to Anthony Rapp and Wilson Cruz.
Very well acted. It felt like a totally natural scene. It didn't feel like it was forced at all. The writing was wonderful. The acting was wonderful. And I've watched it a couple times, and it plays so perfectly every time. So bravo to everyone involved.
Oh, by the way, I love these little random mentions of episode names. I called out Lower Decks a while ago, which people were like, "What? What are you even talking about?" But when they were talking together, and I think Culber had said, "Are you sure that you feel okay?" Stamets said, "Yes, dear doctor." And that just, of course, we had Enterprise's episode, Dear Doctor. So I was like, gotta make a note of that. But yeah, I don't know. I've always kind of been Team Stamets. Like, I didn't think he was the jerk that everyone else thought he was when we met him. So I've kind of been like fighting for redemption for him. And, he risked his life.
Hmm.
He risked his life in this episode
And his career by
his
breaking the
career.
eugenics code. You're not supposed to do that. So
Yeah. Yeah. So I loved all of this. I loved that, he was able to make this connection. Let me see if I did save the quote. I saw the network, an entire universe of possibilities I never knew existed. It's unspeakably beautiful. So, he got to connect with something he loves and is so passionate about. And that got wrapped up in that last scene. And I was just so happy. Uh, so I can't wait to see where Stamets goes. I can't wait to see where all of these characters go. Again, I feel like every one of these episodes, if I had to write a blog instead of do a podcast, I would need like 24 hours to write the entire blog and talk about all of the details. These episodes are just so rich with storytelling and the phenomenal writing. We got some really cool, more disco ball moves, by the way, in this one with the ship. So just every episode continues to just amaze and inspire me. So I guess that's it. Anybody have any final thoughts they'd like to share before we go? Alex?
Can't wait to see where it goes next.
Awesome. Lauren?
Yeah, I'm definitely hooked. I'm really interested to see how everything plays out. And it's just super interesting because we know essentially the future. We know 10 years ahead of now. So I'm really excited to see how everything that's going on plays out. It's really exciting.
Yeah. Jeff, any last words?
Yeah, no, I've just reiterated everybody else's comments. I'm really excited to see where things are going to go. And one of my original points when they first introduced the whole Spore Drive concept, that I was really wondering how they were going to wrap it up so that it became something they couldn't use anymore. So now we've got even more moral dilemmas around the use of the Spore Drive. So I'm even more intrigued about where that's going to go and how that's going to wrap up. So interesting
For
stuff.
sure. All right. Well, keep in mind, we are going to stay around and talk about the F-bomb after the show. But Jeff, why don't you take us on out?
Sure. So while we're on our way out of the show, we always like to go around and tell everyone out in the listener land how they can get in touch with us if they're looking for us. Lauren, how can people find you if they want to chat Discovery with you?
Well, I am on Facebook, Lauren Gonzalez, and I also have a Star Trek page. It's called IDIC St. Louis, that our meetup group runs. So you can definitely find me there. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Very cool. Alex Perry, where can people find you?
Twitter is my main Star Trek jam. That's at Alexander T. Perry. I tweet a lot, almost exclusively about Star Trek, today a lot about Lorca, and would love to keep the conversation going.
All right. Heather Barker, what about you?
I am LLA Posper on Twitter. I also tweet mostly about Star Trek. It's a lot of fun. We are Disco_Trek on Twitter. And then you can find me along with yourself and our buddy Jesse as admins of the unofficial Star Trek Las Vegas convention group on Facebook. That's where you guys have to go to hop in and get a chance to appear on the show. What about you, Jeff? Where can we find you?
Well, you can find me in Las Vegas dressed as a Gorn Santa Claus. But that's only once a year.
Disco Gorn!
The Disco Gorn. Yeah, so I'm Warp Factor Jeff on Twitter. And of course, we also have websites for our shows, the tricordertransmissions.com. You can find all of our shows there. And you can find us on Twitter, as Heather said, at Disco_Trek or at Tricorder Show. So feel free to look us up there. We also have Facebook pages and all that other great stuff linked to our website. And don't forget our voicemail number, 609-512-LLAP, if you'd like a chance to get on your voice on the show. If you're not a winner yet and haven't been able to get on and you want to get on, leave us a voicemail. We'd love to hear from you. And I guess that about ends this episode of DiscoTrek, Heather.
Yeah, I think we're good to go. I'm ready to start talking about that naughty word.
Okay, so the after party begins now. So thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll see you next time.